I never thought shoveling my own driveway would become the biggest mistake of my winter. But here we are, and I'm Paul Emerson, the guy who apparently committed the cardinal sin of clearing snow after sunset in Meadowbrook Heights, Wisconsin. It started on a Tuesday evening in mid-January when I got home from work around 7:30. The snowstorm had dumped about 8 inches of fresh powder across our subdivision, and the temperature was already dropping fast. I knew if I didn't shovel that night, the snow would freeze solid by morning, making it 10 times harder to clear. So I did what any reasonable homeowner would do. I grabbed my shovel, turned on my garage light, and started clearing my driveway. I was about halfway through when I heard the click of heels on pavement. I looked up to see Brenda Hastings, the president of our HOA board, marching toward me with her phone held up like she was recording evidence of a murder. She was wearing this ridiculous puffy white coat that made her look like an angry marshmallow, and her face was pinched tight with that special kind of rage only HOA board presidents seem to possess. "Excuse me, Paul," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" I leaned on my shovel and wiped some sweat off my forehead despite the cold. "Shoveling my driveway, Brenda, same as everyone else." At 7:45 at night, she stopped about 10 feet away, still holding up her phone. "Are you aware that you're in direct violation of Section 12, Paragraph 4 of our HOA covenants?" I stared at her. "What are you talking about?" She lowered her phone and pulled out a printed document from her coat pocket. I had no idea how she had it ready to go, but that was Brenda for you. Always prepared to make someone's life miserable. It clearly states that all outdoor maintenance activities, including but not limited to lawn mowing, hedge trimming, and snow removal, must be conducted between the hours of 8 a.m. and 7 p.m. to maintain the peaceful character of our community. "You're joking." I looked around at the other houses. Several of my neighbors were also outside shoveling their driveways in the dark. "What about them?" "I'll be addressing them next," Brenda said primly. "But since you're the one I caught first, you'll be receiving the initial citation. Consider this your formal warning. If you continue, you'll be fined $250. I felt my jaw clench. "Brenda, it's winter in Wisconsin. Sometimes it snows after 7 p.m. What are we supposed to do? Let it pile up?" "You should have come home earlier to address it during approved hours," she said, like this was the most obvious thing in the world. "Or you could wake up early tomorrow morning to clear it after 8 a.m. It'll be frozen solid by then." "That's not my problem, Paul. Rules are rules." She turned on her heel and started walking toward my neighbor's house, where Mike Robertson was clearing his sidewalk. I stood there in the cold, my breath coming out in angry clouds, and watched her march across the street. Part of me wanted to keep shoveling just to spite her, but I knew Brenda well enough to know she wasn't bluffing about the fine. Our HOA had a reputation for being aggressive with enforcement, and Brenda took it to another level. She'd once fined a family $300 because their Christmas lights were the wrong shade of white, so I did something I probably should have thought through more carefully. I stopped shoveling. Right there, right then, with half my driveway still covered in snow. I walked my shovel back into the garage, turned off the light, and went inside. My wife Sarah looked up from her laptop when I came in, still wearing my boots. "Done already?" "Nope, got about halfway," she frowned. "Why'd you stop?" I explained what happened, and I watched her expression shift from confusion to disbelief to something close to anger. Sarah was usually the calm, rational one in our relationship, but HOA nonsense was one thing that could set her off. "That's absolutely ridiculous," she said. "We can't just leave the driveway half shoveled. Watch me." I kicked off my boots and headed for the kitchen. If Brenda wants to enforce some stupid rule about snow removal hours, then I'll follow it to the letter. No more shoveling after 7 p.m. ever. But honey, that's not practical. Neither is a $250 fine for being a responsible homeowner. Sarah opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. She knew I had a point. We'd already paid over $800 in HOA fees this year, and it was only January. The last thing we needed was more fines for violating rules that made no sense. The next morning, I woke up early and looked out the window. Just as I'd predicted, the snow on my half-cleared driveway had frozen into a lumpy, icy mess. The part I'd managed to shovel the night before was clear and easy to walk on. The part I'd left was now a hazard zone, and to make matters worse, it had snowed another 3 inches overnight. I checked my watch. 7:45 a.m. Still 15 minutes before the approved snow removal hours began. So I made myself a cup of coffee and waited, watching the clock like it was New Year's Eve. At exactly 8 a.m., I went outside with my shovel and an ice chipper. Several of my neighbors were already out, dealing with the same frozen mess I was facing. The ones who'd finished shoveling the night before, ignoring Brenda's warnings, had nice clear driveways. The ones who'd stopped when told now had twice the work to do. Mike Robertson waved at me from across the street. "Can you believe that woman?" he shouted. "I got the fine, $250 for shoveling at 8 p.m. She actually went through with it. Email came at 6 this morning." He shook his head and went back to chipping at the ice. I started working on my driveway, and it was brutal. The frozen snow didn't want to budge, and when it finally did break free, it came up in heavy, irregular chunks that were twice as hard to move as fresh powder. What should have taken me 30 minutes the night before now took almost 2 hours. By the time I finished, I was sweating despite the 20-degree temperature, and my back was screaming. I looked at my cleared driveway and felt nothing but resentment. This was stupid. This whole situation was stupid. And it was all because Brenda Hastings had nothing better to do than police when people shoveled their driveways. I went to work angry and stayed angry all day. My coworkers could tell something was wrong, but I didn't want to explain that I was upset about snow removal rules. It sounded insane even in my own head. That evening I got home around 6:30. The weather forecast was calling for another storm system to move through overnight, with potential accumulation of 6 to 10 inches. I looked at my driveway, then at my watch, then back at my driveway. The smart thing to do would be to wait and see if it actually snowed, then shovel in the morning during approved hours. But I was still angry, and anger makes people do interesting things. I decided right then that I wasn't going to shovel anymore. Not during approved hours, not during unapproved hours, not at all. If the HOA wanted to dictate when I could maintain my own property, then they could deal with the consequences of their stupid rules. Sarah thought I was being childish when I told her my plan. She was probably right. But I was committed now. The snow started falling around 9 p.m., and by the time we went to bed, there was already 4 inches on the ground. I slept better than I had in weeks. Morning came and I looked out at my driveway. Nearly a foot of fresh snow covered it completely. The street had been plowed at some point during the night, which meant there was an extra ridge of heavy, wet snow blocking the end of my driveway. It was a disaster, and I wasn't going to touch it. I called my boss and worked from home that day. Sarah had to go to her office, so I helped her shovel a narrow path from the garage to the street, just wide enough for her car to get through. The rest of the driveway stayed buried. By mid-morning, I got an email from the HOA. It was from Brenda, of course, and it was CC'd to the entire board. "Dear Mr. Emerson," it read, It has come to our attention that your property at 847 Maple Ridge Drive is not in compliance with Section 8, Paragraph 2 of our HOA covenants, which states that all driveways and walkways must be cleared of snow and ice within 24 hours of snowfall cessation. Please address this violation immediately to avoid a fine of $300. Regards, Brenda Hastings, HOA Board President. I read it twice, then I started laughing. I couldn't help it. The absurdity of the situation was too much. I couldn't shovel after dark without getting fined, but I also couldn't leave my driveway uncleared without getting fined. It was a perfect catch-22. I wrote back, making sure to reply all so the entire board saw my response. Dear Miss Hastings, thank you for your email. I was prepared to clear my driveway last evening when the snow was fresh and manageable, but I was informed that doing so would violate Section 12, Paragraph 4 regarding approved maintenance hours. As the snow did not stop falling until after 7 p.m., and approved hours don't begin until 8 a.m., this created a situation where compliance with one rule necessitates violation of another. I'm happy to discuss this contradiction with the full HOA board at your earliest convenience. Best regards, Paul Emerson. I hit send and felt a small surge of satisfaction. Let them chew on that for a while. The response came faster than I expected. Within an hour, I had an email from another board member, a guy named Richard Palmer, who I'd always thought was fairly reasonable. Paul, I see your point and I think it's valid. However, the 24-hour clearance rule gives you until this evening to address your driveway. I'd recommend taking care of it during approved hours today to avoid any fines. I'll bring up the contradiction at our next board meeting. It was a diplomatic response and probably good advice, but I was already too far down this rabbit hole to turn back now. I wrote back thanking him for his email and explaining that due to the timing of the snowfall and the approved hours restriction, the snow had frozen into a condition that was extremely difficult to clear, and I was concerned about the liability of potentially injuring myself trying to chip through ice that wouldn't have formed if I'd been allowed to clear it when it was fresh. This was technically true. The longer snow sits, the harder it becomes to remove, and Wisconsin winters were no joke. People threw out their backs shoveling all the time. Richard didn't respond to that one. Over the next few days, my driveway became a neighborhood spectacle. The snow wasn't melting. In fact, it kept snowing, adding a few inches here and there every couple of days. My driveway went from buried to absolutely entombed. Sarah had to park on the street because even the narrow path we'd cleared had disappeared under subsequent snowfalls. I got more emails from Brenda, each one more threatening than the last. The fine went from $300 to $500 to $750. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I forwarded each one to Richard with a simple note, still waiting for the board to address the conflicting rules. My neighbors started talking. Some of them thought I was making a good point. Others thought I was being ridiculous and making the neighborhood look bad. I didn't particularly care either way. This had stopped being about the snow and started being about the principle of the thing. The real turning point came on a Saturday morning about 2 weeks into my shoveling strike. I was in my kitchen making breakfast when I heard shouting outside. I looked out the window and saw Brenda standing at the end of my driveway, gesturing wildly at the snow while talking to 2 other board members. One was Richard, the other was a woman named Susan Chen who served as the board secretary. I grabbed my coat and went outside. "Good morning," I said pleasantly. "Can I help you with something?" Brenda whirled around, her face already red from either cold or anger. "This is completely unacceptable, Paul. Your driveway is a hazard and an eyesore. You're bringing down property values for the entire street. I'd love to clear it, I said, but I'm following the rules. No maintenance after 7 p.m. and snow needs to be cleared within 24 hours of cessation. Unfortunately, it keeps snowing after 7 p.m., which means by the time approved hours roll around, it's already turned to ice. I'm not equipped to handle that kind of removal safely. That's the most ridiculous excuse I've ever heard, Brenda snapped. Is it though? Richard stepped forward, looking tired. Paul's got a point, Brenda. The rules do contradict each other in this specific scenario. Then he should hire a snow removal service. The approved hours rule applies to commercial services too, I pointed out. It's in Section 12, Paragraph 6. All contractors must operate during the same approved hours as residents. Brenda's eye twitched. I don't think she'd expected me to actually read the HOA covenants in detail, but I'd spent the last 2 weeks doing exactly that. I'd found all sorts of interesting contradictions and vague clauses. We could grant him a variance, Susan suggested quietly, for emergency snow removal. Absolutely not, Brenda said. If we start granting variances, everyone will want one. The rules exist for a reason. What reason? I asked. What possible reason is there to prevent people from shoveling snow after dark? Peace and quiet, Brenda said. Noise ordinances. Some of us don't want to listen to shoveling and snow blowers at all hours. Then maybe the rule should have exceptions for weather emergencies, Richard said. This is Wisconsin. Snow doesn't follow a schedule. Brenda looked like she wanted to explode, but she kept it together. Fine. I'm calling an emergency board meeting for Monday night. Paul, you're required to attend. I'll be there, I said. They left, and I went back inside to my now cold breakfast. Sarah had been watching from the window. This is getting out of hand, she said. Probably, I agreed. Are you actually going to die on this hill, over snow removal hours? I thought about it. Yeah, I think I am. Because if I back down now, Brenda wins and she'll keep making up stupid rules and enforcing them just because she can. Someone needs to push back. Sarah sighed but didn't argue. She knew I could be stubborn when I felt strongly about something. Monday night arrived, and I showed up at the community center where the HOA held its meetings. The room was more crowded than usual. Apparently, word had gotten around about my driveway situation, and people were curious to see how it would play out. The board sat at a table in front. Brenda was in the center, with Richard and Susan on either side. 2 other board members I barely knew, Gary Brennan and Linda Kowalski, filled out the panel. Brenda called the meeting to order and immediately launched into the issue. We're here tonight to address the ongoing violation at 847 Maple Ridge Drive, where resident Paul Emerson has failed to maintain his driveway in accordance with our community standards. I'd like to address that characterization, I said, standing up. I haven't failed to maintain anything. I've been prevented from maintaining my property by contradictory rules that make compliance impossible. Explain, Gary said. He was an older guy, maybe late 60s, with a white beard and a no-nonsense attitude. I walked them through the whole situation. The snow falling after 7 p.m. The rule against maintenance activities after approved hours. The 24-hour clearance requirement. The way the snow froze when left overnight, making it exponentially harder to remove safely. The threat of fines either way. So what you're saying, Linda said slowly, is that our rules make it impossible to properly maintain a driveway when it snows in the evening. In the winter in Wisconsin, it almost always snows in the evening, I said. Storm systems don't arrive at convenient times. Richard nodded. I've reviewed the covenants and Paul's right. The rules do contradict each other. We need to either amend the approved hours for snow removal or remove the time restriction entirely for weather-related maintenance. I disagree, Brenda said sharply. The approved hours exist for quality of life reasons. We can't have people running snow blowers at midnight. Nobody's asking to run snow blowers at midnight, I said. But if it stops snowing at 8 p.m., we should be able to clear it at 8 p.m., or 9 or 10, whenever we can get to it. That's a slippery slope, Brenda insisted. No, it's common sense, Gary said. I was surprised. He'd always seemed like someone who'd side with Brenda on everything. I've been on this board for 8 years, and we've never had this problem come up because most people just ignore the rule and shovel when they need to. Paul's the first person to actually push back on it, and he's showing us that we've got a real problem with our covenants. So we just let him violate the rules. Brenda's voice was getting shrill. We fix the rules, Susan said. That's our job, to make rules that actually work for the community. The debate went on for another 40 minutes. Several residents stood up to share their opinions. Most of them sided with me, though a few agreed with Brenda that approved hours should be strictly enforced. One woman even suggested that the HOA should hire a community-wide snow removal service that would handle all driveways during approved hours, which was immediately shot down when Richard pointed out how expensive that would be. Finally, Gary made a motion to suspend the approved hours rule for snow and ice removal from November through March, with the understanding that residents should still be respectful of noise levels and avoid running loud equipment after 10 p.m. unless absolutely necessary. Linda seconded it. The vote was 4-1 in favor, with only Brenda voting against. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. We'd actually done it. The rule was changed. Fine, Brenda said coldly. The motion passes, but Paul, you still need to clear your driveway. It's been weeks. The 24-hour rule still applies, and you're way past that deadline. I'll clear it this week, I said. But I want something in writing that states all previous fines related to this situation are waived. Brenda looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. Absolutely not. You still violated the clearance rule. Because of the contradiction in the covenants, Richard said. Paul's right, Brenda. We can't fine him for a situation we created. Another vote. This one was 3-2, with Gary and Richard siding with me, Susan and Linda siding with Brenda, and Brenda casting the deciding vote against, which meant the fine stood. That's nearly $800, I said, doing the math in my head. Should have thought of that before you decided to be difficult, Brenda said with a tight smile. I left the meeting angry all over again. Sarah was waiting up for me when I got home. How'd it go? Good and bad. I explained the rule change and the fines. $800 is a lot of money, Sarah said carefully. I know. I sat down heavily on the couch, but I'm not paying it. Those fines are bogus and I'll fight them. How? I don't know yet, but there has to be something in the covenants about disputing fines. And if there's not, I'll find a lawyer who specializes in HOA law. Sarah looked worried, but she squeezed my hand. Okay, we'll figure it out. The next morning, I woke up early and started the process of clearing my driveway. It was even worse than I'd anticipated. The snow had compacted and frozen into layers that were almost like concrete in some spots. I had to use a heavy metal ice scraper to break through the top layer, then shovel out the chunks, then repeat the process. It was back-breaking work, and it took me most of the day. Several neighbors came by to help, which I appreciated. Mike Robertson brought his own ice chipper. A younger couple from down the street, Jake and Emma Torres, showed up with thermoses of hot coffee. Even Richard stopped by to lend a hand for an hour. I'm sorry about the fines, he said while we were taking a break. I pushed for waiving them, but Brenda can be stubborn. Tell me about it, I muttered. For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing. Those rules needed to change. At $800, I hope so." By evening, my driveway was finally clear. My entire body ached and I was pretty sure I'd developed new muscles just from the effort. But it was done. I thought that would be the end of it. The rules were changed, my driveway was clear, and I'd made my point. The fines were annoying, but I'd figure out how to fight them. But of course, this was an HOA situation, which meant nothing was ever simple. 2 days later, I got another email from Brenda. This one informed me that I was being fined an additional $500 for deliberate damage to community aesthetics and property values during the period of non-compliance. I read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. They were fining me for making the neighborhood look bad by having a snowy driveway. The driveway that I couldn't clear because of their rules. The driveway that I'd been threatened with fines for clearing after hours. That driveway. I forwarded the email to Richard with a simple message. "Is this legal?" His response came an hour later. "I have no idea. I wasn't consulted on this fine, and I don't think the rest of the board was either. This might be Brenda acting independently, which she's not authorized to do. I'm calling an emergency session." The emergency board meeting happened 3 days later. This time, Brenda was on the defensive. "You can't just issue fines without board approval," Gary said, looking at the email on his phone. "That's not how this works." "I'm the president," Brenda said. "I have discretionary authority for violations." "For minor violations," Susan corrected. "Things like lawn furniture left out or decorations up past approved dates, not for $500 fines." "This was a major violation," Brenda insisted. "No," Richard said firmly. "This was a manufactured crisis that you created by enforcing a bad rule, and now you're trying to pile on additional fines out of spite." "I'm doing my job. Your job is to serve the community," Linda said quietly, "not to punish people for questioning bad policies." The meeting got heated. Several residents had shown up again, and most of them were on my side. A few spoke up about their own issues with Brenda's aggressive enforcement style. One man talked about getting fined because his house number wasn't visible enough from the street, even though he'd just repainted it. A woman described being cited for having flowers that were the wrong color according to the approved landscaping palette. It became clear pretty quickly that I wasn't the only person who'd had problems with Brenda's approach to HOA management. I was just the first one to push back hard enough to make it a public issue. The meeting ended with another vote to rescind my latest fine. This time it was unanimous, with even Brenda voting yes after it became clear she'd lose anyway. But the atmosphere in the room was tense. Brenda's authority had been challenged, and she wasn't taking it well. Over the next few weeks, things got weird. I'd get emails from Brenda about tiny, technical violations. My trash cans were visible from the street for 15 minutes longer than allowed. There was a small patch of ice on my sidewalk that could be considered a hazard. My house numbers needed to be repainted because they were fading. Each email came with a warning about potential fines. I documented everything. Every email, every interaction, every petty complaint. I had a feeling I was going to need it. The breaking point came in late February. We got hit with another major snowstorm, this time during the day. It started around 2 p.m. and didn't stop until after midnight. I let it accumulate until about 9 p.m. when there was a natural break in the snowfall, then went out with my shovel and cleared my driveway. It took about 45 minutes and I was done by 10. I was careful to be quiet. I didn't use a snow blower. I just hand-shoveled everything, trying to be respectful of the neighbors. The next morning, I had an email from Brenda. Another fine, this time for $300, for excessive noise violations during restricted hours. I called Richard immediately. She's claiming I was making excessive noise, I said. I was hand shoveling. There's no way it was excessive. Do you have any proof? Like what? A recording of me shoveling quietly, Richard sighed. This is getting ridiculous. Let me talk to the board. But before he could, something else happened. Mike Robertson called me that afternoon. Hey, Paul, you're not going to believe this. I just got a fine for noise violations, too, from last night. Were you shoveling? Yeah, around the same time as you. Used my snow blower for maybe 10 minutes. But here's the thing. I went back and checked when I got the email. The fine was time-stamped at 9:45 p.m. I didn't even start shoveling until 9:30. I felt something click in my brain. So Brenda sent you a fine before you even committed the alleged violation. Looks that way. That's not enforcement. That's harassment. I called Richard back and told him about Mike's fine. Then I called around to other neighbors who'd been out shoveling the night before. Turns out 6 of us had received identical fines, all time-stamped before, or during the time we were actually shoveling. Brenda had pre-written the fines and sent them out like she was trawling for violations. The emergency board meeting this time was intense. All 6 of us showed up with our emails and our documentation. Richard had pulled the HOA's bylaws and covenant rules, and he walked the board through the proper procedure for issuing violations and fines. You have to witness the violation or have documented proof, he said. You can't just assume people are going to violate rules and fine them preemptively. I knew they were going to violate the noise ordinance, Brenda said. They were all outside shoveling during restricted hours. The restricted hours for maintenance are suspended for snow removal from November through March, Gary reminded her. We changed that rule. The noise ordinance is separate, Brenda shot back. Hand shoveling snow doesn't violate noise ordinances, Susan said. And even if it did, you can't fine people before they do anything wrong. This is targeted harassment, I said, and I'm not the only one being targeted. The other 5 homeowners nodded. Mike showed his time-stamped email. A woman named Patricia Davis showed a series of emails from Brenda going back months, documenting tiny violations and threats of fines for things like a lawn decoration being 3 inches over the property line. I think we need to have a serious conversation about leadership, Linda said carefully. Brenda's face went red. Are you suggesting I should step down? I'm suggesting that your approach to enforcement is creating problems instead of solving them, Linda said, and that maybe it's time for someone else to serve as board president. What followed was one of the most uncomfortable hours of my life. The board went back and forth about whether to call for a vote of no confidence in Brenda's leadership. The residents in attendance were divided. Some thought Brenda was doing her job and we were all just being difficult. Others thought she'd gone too far and needed to be reined in. Eventually, Gary called for a vote. The motion was to remove Brenda as board president but keep her on the board as a regular member. It passed 3-2, with Gary, Richard, and Susan voting yes. Brenda stood up, her face white with rage. This is absurd. I've dedicated years to this community. And we appreciate that, Richard said. But the role of board president requires judgment and restraint. We need to rebuild trust with the community. Brenda grabbed her coat and stormed out. The meeting continued without her, with Richard being voted in as the new board president. His first act was to officially rescind all the questionable fines that had been issued over the past 2 months, including my original $800 tab. I felt like I could breathe again. The story should have ended there, but life isn't that neat. About a week after Brenda was removed as president, I started noticing weird things around my property. Small things at first. My mailbox flag was bent down. The newspaper I still got delivered showed up torn. The motion sensor light on my garage kept getting turned off. I thought maybe it was just coincidence or weather or something. Then one morning I went out to my car and found that someone had let the air out of two of my tires. Not slashed them, just opened the valve stems and let the air out. It was annoying and time-consuming but not actually criminal. Sarah was worried. You think it's Brenda? I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe it's someone who agrees with her and thinks I'm a troublemaker. I installed a security camera pointed at my driveway and front yard. It wasn't something I'd ever thought I'd need in a quiet suburban neighborhood, but here we were. 3 days later, the camera caught someone. At 2:30 in the morning, a figure in dark clothes walked up my driveway and poured something on my lawn. The camera's night vision wasn't great, but I could tell it was a woman about Brenda's height and build. I reviewed the footage a dozen times. Then I called the non-emergency police line. The officer who showed up was a middle-aged guy named Officer Patterson. He watched the video and took notes. Can you identify the person? I think so, I said, but I'm not 100% certain. What did they pour on your lawn? I don't know. I haven't checked yet. We went outside together, and even in the dark with flashlights, I could see what had been done. Someone had poured what looked like salt or maybe some kind of chemical in lines across my front lawn, spelling out the word snitch. Officer Patterson took pictures and collected a sample of the substance. This is vandalism, he said, and potentially trespassing. Do you have any idea who might want to do this? I explained the whole situation with the HOA, Brenda's removal as president, and the ongoing tension. Officer Patterson listened and took more notes. We'll investigate, he said. In the meantime, keep your cameras running and document anything else that happens. Over the next week, nothing else occurred. The substance on my lawn turned out to be rock salt, which killed the grass in those spots, but wasn't dangerous. The police talked to Brenda, who denied everything and said she'd been home asleep at the time in question. Without a clear identification from the video, there wasn't much they could do. Officer Patterson told me I could pursue it as a civil matter if I wanted, but it probably wasn't worth the hassle unless something else happened. I thought that was the end of it. The lawn damage was annoying, but grass grows back. And Brenda had made her point, whatever that point was supposed to be. Then in early March, Mike Robertson called me in a panic. Paul, you need to come over here right now. I drove over to his house and found him standing in his garage, looking at his snow blower, or what was left of it. Someone had taken a sledgehammer or something similar to it, smashing the engine housing and bending the auger blades beyond repair. When did this happen? Sometime last night, Mike said. I was going to use it this morning because we're supposed to get more snow tonight and I found it like this. Did you call the police? Yeah, they're on their way. Officer Patterson showed up again along with another officer. They took statements and photos. Mike had a security camera too, but it was pointed at his driveway, not inside his garage. Whoever did it had been careful. This is escalating, Officer Patterson said. First vandalism at your place, now destruction of property here. Do you two have the same enemies? Mike and I looked at each other. We were both involved in the situation with the HOA, I said. Patterson frowned. The snow shoveling thing you told me about. Yeah, he made a note. We'll follow up with all the parties involved, but there wasn't much to follow up on. Brenda had an alibi for the night of Mike's snow blower destruction. She'd been at a dinner party with 6 other people until after midnight and they all vouched for her. Maybe it's not her, Sarah suggested that night. Maybe it's someone else. Like who? I don't know. But maybe Brenda has friends who are doing this on her behalf. It was a disturbing thought, but not impossible. The police investigation continued, but without solid evidence, They couldn't charge anyone. Mike filed an insurance claim for his snow blower. I kept my cameras running and tried to move on with life. Then in mid-March, things took a turn I never saw coming. Richard called me on a Saturday morning. "Paul, can you come to an emergency board meeting this afternoon? Something's come up." "What kind of something?" "I'd rather explain in person. Can you make it at 2?" I agreed and spent the next few hours wondering what could possibly be so urgent. The snow season was basically over. Most of the drama had died down. What else could there be? I showed up at the community center at 2 and found not just the board but also several other residents, including Mike, Patricia, and a few others who'd been fined during Brenda's enforcement spree. Also present were 2 people I didn't recognize, a man and woman in business suits. Richard stood up and looked uncomfortable. "Thanks for coming, everyone. I want to introduce you to Daniel Morris and Karen Chen from the law firm of Morris and Associates. They've been retained by someone in our community to pursue a lawsuit against the HOA." My stomach dropped. A lawsuit? The woman, Karen, stepped forward. "Yes. Our client is suing the Meadowbrook Heights HOA for harassment, abuse of authority, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The lawsuit names the HOA as an entity and specifically names several board members, both current and former, as defendants." "Who's the client?" someone asked. "I can't disclose that at this time," Karen said. "But I can tell you that the lawsuit alleges a pattern of behavior by former board president Brenda Hastings that goes well beyond normal HOA enforcement and into the realm of targeted harassment." Richard looked miserable. "They've requested access to all HOA records for the past 3 years, including emails, fine records, and board meeting minutes." "Isn't that confidential?" Patricia asked. "Not when there's a lawsuit," Daniel said. "We've filed a discovery motion, and the court has granted access to all relevant documents." The meeting went on for another hour, with the lawyers explaining what the lawsuit meant for the HOA and for those of us who might be called as witnesses. It was overwhelming and stressful, and I left feeling like I'd opened a can of worms that I couldn't close. Sarah was waiting at home. "How bad is it?" "Someone's suing the HOA, professional lawyers. This is serious." "Is it about your situation?" "Partially, I think. But also about the overall pattern of harassment." Over the next few weeks, more details emerged. The person who filed the lawsuit was actually 2 people, a married couple named Brian and Teresa Keller who lived on the other side of the neighborhood. I barely knew them, but apparently they'd been dealing with Brenda's aggressive enforcement for over 2 years. Their story was worse than mine. Brenda had fined them repeatedly for minor violations, some of which they claimed weren't actually violations at all. When they tried to fight the fines, Brenda had retaliated by increasing inspections of their property and issuing even more citations. The harassment had gotten so bad that Teresa had developed anxiety issues, and Brian had considered selling their house just to get away from the situation. The lawsuit laid it all out in excruciating detail. Pages and pages of documented fines, threatening emails, and instances of Brenda exceeding her authority as board president. My situation with the snow shoveling was mentioned as one of many examples of contradictory rules being used as weapons rather than community guidelines. The HOA's insurance company got involved, hiring their own lawyers. The board had to call a special meeting to vote on whether to settle the lawsuit or fight it in court. After reviewing the evidence and the potential costs, they voted to settle. The settlement was substantial. The Kellers received a cash payment that covered their legal fees and compensated them for the harassment they'd endured. The HOA also agreed to a complete review and revision of all covenants and rules, with input from residents. Additionally, all fines issued during Brenda's tenure as president would be reviewed by an independent third party to determine if they were legitimate. But the biggest part of the settlement was this. Brenda Hastings had to resign from the HOA board entirely and agree to never seek election to any HOA leadership position in Meadowbrook Heights again. When the settlement was announced at a community meeting, there was a mix of reactions. Some people were relieved. Others thought the settlement was too harsh. Brenda herself didn't attend the meeting, but I heard through the grapevine that she was furious. The independent review of fines took about a month. When it was complete, the reviewer found that approximately 40% of the fines Brenda had issued were either improper or based on rules that were being selectively enforced. My snow shoveling fines were officially voided, as were Mike's and Patricia's and dozens of others. The HOA ended up refunding over $15,000 to various homeowners. The rule review process was actually kind of interesting. The board set up a committee of residents to go through every single rule in the covenants and evaluate whether it made sense, whether it was being enforced consistently, and whether it was even legal in some cases. I volunteered for the committee, partly because I wanted to help fix the problems and partly because I wanted to make sure nothing like this happened again. We met every Tuesday night for 2 months, working our way through page after page of regulations. Some rules we kept as is. Things like architectural guidelines for major renovations made sense and were fairly applied. Other rules we modified. The noise ordinance got rewritten to be more specific and to include common sense exceptions for things like snow removal and emergency repairs. And some rules we just deleted entirely. The approved hours for maintenance work got completely removed, replaced with a simple guideline to be considerate of neighbors when doing noisy work early in the morning or late at night. The approved color palette for landscaping was scrapped. The specific requirements for holiday decoration timing were loosened. By the time we finished, the HOA covenants were about 30% shorter and way more reasonable. The board put it to a community vote, and it passed with over 80% approval. Life slowly returned to normal. The vandalism stopped after the settlement was announced, which made me wonder if it had been Brenda all along or someone acting on her behalf. The police investigation eventually went cold without any charges being filed. Mike got a new snow blower. I reseeded the damaged parts of my lawn. Sarah and I celebrated by hosting a barbecue in our backyard and inviting the neighbors who'd helped shovel my driveway that awful day in January. Richard turned out to be a pretty good board president. He was fair, reasonable, and actually willing to listen to residents when they had concerns. Under his leadership, the HOA became less of a source of stress and more of what it was supposed to be. A way to maintain property values and community standards without making everyone miserable. I never saw Brenda again at any community events. Someone told me she'd stopped attending HOA meetings entirely, even as a regular resident. A few months later, I heard that she and her husband had put their house on the market. They moved out in late summer, and I honestly felt relieved. The following winter, when the first major snowstorm hit in December, I waited until about 8 p.m. when the snow stopped falling. Then I went out with my shovel and cleared my driveway without worrying about fines or rules or HOA presidents with grudges. Several of my neighbors were doing the same thing. We waved at each other, helped each other with the heavy spots, and then went inside to warm up. It was such a normal, simple thing. Exactly how it should have been all along. Looking back on the whole experience, I still think it's kind of insane that it came down to snow shoveling hours. Of all the things to fight about with an HOA, that seems like it should be near the bottom of the list. But I guess that's the thing about HOAs and rules in general. Sometimes the specific issue doesn't matter as much as the principle behind it. The principle here was simple. Rules should make sense. They should be applied fairly, and the people enforcing them should be doing it to help the community, not to exercise power over others. When that balance gets out of whack, someone has to push back. I didn't set out to be that person. I just wanted to shovel my driveway. But once I started pushing back, I realized I wasn't alone. There were plenty of other people in the neighborhood who were frustrated with the same issues but hadn't felt empowered to speak up. The lawsuit from the Kellers was probably inevitable. Brenda's approach to HOA enforcement was unsustainable, and eventually she was going to push too hard against someone who had the resources and determination to fight back legally. I'm glad they did it, even though it was stressful for everyone involved. The community needed that wake-up call. These days, our HOA is pretty boring, which is exactly how it should be. The board handles basic maintenance issues, organizes a few community events each year, and generally stays out of people's way. The rules still exist, but they're enforced with common sense and flexibility. I'm still on the Rules Review Committee, which meets quarterly now to address any issues that come up. It's not exciting work, but it feels important. We're making sure that what happened with Brenda can't happen again, at least not easily. Sarah jokes that I've become an HOA activist, which isn't entirely wrong. I never thought I'd care this much about homeowner association politics, but here we are. Sometimes life takes you in unexpected directions. The funny thing is, I actually appreciate our HOA now. Having clear, reasonable rules that everyone understands and agrees on makes the neighborhood better. Property values have stayed stable. Disputes between neighbors get resolved fairly. The community spaces are well maintained. It's what an HOA should be, without the petty tyranny. Mike Robertson and I are good friends now. We get together every few weeks to watch football and complain about work and normal stuff. Sometimes we joke about the great snow shoveling incident of last winter, but mostly we've moved on. His new snow blower is top of the line, and he loves it. Patricia Davis ended up running for the HOA board and won. She's been a great addition, bringing a resident's perspective to the decision-making process. She's particularly good at spotting rules that sound reasonable on paper, but would be nightmares to actually enforce. The Kellers, who filed the lawsuit, have become more active in the community too. Brian joined the Architectural Review Committee, and Teresa volunteers with the Neighborhood Watch program. I think the settlement gave them a sense of closure and allowed them to actually enjoy living here again. As for me, I learned some valuable lessons from the whole experience. I learned that sometimes you have to stand up for yourself, even when it's uncomfortable. I learned that most rules exist for good reasons, but some rules are just stupid and need to be changed. I learned that communities function best when everyone has a voice and feels heard. Most importantly, I learned to read HOA covenants very, very carefully before signing them. Would I do anything differently if I could go back? Maybe. I probably could have handled some of the confrontations with Brenda more diplomatically. I definitely could have been less stubborn about letting my driveway stay buried for weeks, which was admittedly a bit childish. But overall, I think things worked out the way they needed to. Sometimes you have to escalate a situation to create change, and sometimes being a little bit stubborn is what it takes to make people pay attention. The neighborhood is better now than it was a year ago. The rules are better. The leadership is better. The sense of community is stronger because we all went through this experience together and came out the other side. And I can shovel my driveway whenever I need to, which is really all I wanted in the first place. Last week, we got our first major snowstorm of this winter. 8 inches fell overnight and I woke up early to clear it. As I was shoveling, Richard walked by with his dog. "Getting it done before work," he called out. "Yeah, figured I'd take care of it while it's still fresh," I said. He grinned. "Smart thinking, that's the way to do it." "Learned my lesson last year," I said. We both laughed, and he continued his walk. I finished my driveway, helped Sarah clear her car, and then went inside for breakfast before heading to work. It was a completely normal winter morning in Wisconsin, which is exactly what it should have been all along. Sometimes the best ending is just getting back to normal, to the way things should work when everyone's being reasonable and following the spirit of the rules instead of using them as weapons. Our HOA isn't perfect, but it's functional and fair, and that's all anyone can really ask for. I still live at 847 Maple Ridge Drive in Meadowbrook Heights, Wisconsin. My driveway gets shoveled when it needs to be shoveled. My grass is maintained but not obsessively perfect. My house numbers are visible but not painted with military precision. And if it snows after dark, I go outside with my shovel and clear it, and nobody sends me angry emails or threatens me with fines. That's what victory looks like in HOA land. Not dramatic courtroom scenes or public confrontations, but simply being able to maintain your own property with common sense and dignity. Though I have to admit, there's a part of me that still gets a little thrill of rebellion every time I shovel after 7 p.m. After everything that happened, it feels like a tiny act of defiance against petty tyranny. Sarah says I need to let it go and stop being so dramatic about snow removal. She's probably right. But every time I see that clear driveway in the morning, ready for the day ahead, I remember what it took to get here. And I think about other people in other neighborhoods who might be dealing with their own Brenda Hastings, their own contradictory rules, their own feelings of powerlessness against HOA overreach. To those people, I'd say this: read your covenants, know your rights, document everything. And don't be afraid to push back when rules stop making sense. Because at the end of the day, an HOA is supposed to serve the community, not the other way around. And when that relationship gets inverted, it's up to the residents to set it right again. Even if it means letting your driveway stay buried in snow for a few weeks to make a point. Would I recommend that strategy? Probably not. It was cold, it was petty, and it made my life harder for a while, but it worked. And sometimes that's enough.